Hey y'all, today we're going to be doing chapters 5 and 6 of Alabama Moon. Yesterday I asked you guys to focus and think about if Moon's plan is going to happen, if it's a realistic plan, if you think that he can really get to Alaska. And we'll see. Today his plan is to go to Mr. Abrascado's store. He's got Pap's belongings, and remember, he's planning on selling them so that he can get some money, and he's going to ask Mr. Abrascado for some advice on getting to Alaska. So let's get started. Chapters 5 and 6 today. This is chapter 5. I put my box on the floor of Mr. Abrascado's store and sat on it. I was tired and breathing hard. "Are you all right, Moon?" Mr. Abrascado asked me. I nodded at the floor. "You carry that box all the way from your place by yourself?" I nodded again. Finally, catching my breath, I looked up at him. "I was hoping you might want to buy that stuff in it." "Well, where's your father at?" "He's dead." Mr. Abrascado put his hands on the counter and leaned toward me. "Dead?" "Yes, sir." "When?" "Yesterday." "How?" "He broke his leg and it got infected." Mr. Abrascado frowned and shook his head. "I guess he didn't want you coming after a doctor." "No, sir. He always said when it—" "Oh, I know what he always said. You wait here while I call the constable." Now, constable is kind of like a policeman, okay? So he told Moon, "You wait here while I call the constable." "You don't need to worry about that, Mr. Abrascado. I already buried him up in the cedar grove near Mama." "Moon, you just can't go off burying somebody like that without letting the law know about it." "Pap wanted it that way." "Well, your Pap wanted lots of things that don't make sense. I don't mind telling you that." Mr. Abrascado walked over to the wall and lifted the telephone receiver. I stood and I grabbed my box off the floor. "If you call the law, they'll take me away. I don't aim to go with them." He watched me for a moment and then put the receiver back on the hook. He shook his head, rubbed his eyes. "Put your box down," he said. "Get that chair behind you and pull it up here." I did as he said. "What do you want to eat?" he asked me. "I don't have any money for extras. I gotta save it." "That's all right. It's for free." "Bologna and cheese." "With mustard?" "No, thanks. That's all." Mr. Abrascado began to fix me a sandwich. My mouth watered at the bologna, cheese, and bread that I only saw when I came to his store. "I'm sorry about your father, Moon. I didn't mean to sound like I wasn't." "That's okay. He said I'd feel better after a while." "Where are you headed when you leave here?" "Alaska." "How do you plan on getting to Alaska?" "Sell the watch and things in this box. And I've got the money left over from the last time we were here." "I see. What are you going to do when you get there?" Pap said there's other people like us there. He said you can get away from the government up there. He said you can homestead." Guys, homestead means like live off the land. You don't have to go to the stores and things like that. "That's what he said?" "Yes, sir. So that's where I figure I'll go." Mr. Abrascado handed me the sandwich and leaned on the counter watching me eat. "You know how cold it is in Alaska?" I chewed and shrugged my shoulders. "You not worried about freezing up there?" "Pap said there's a lot of people like us in Alaska that I can stay with. He said there's more than ever these days." "Have you ever thought about school, Moon?" "I study my books almost every day." Mr. Abrascado shook his head. "That's not what I mean. I mean with other children. Pap said he could teach me better than any school." "Do you know how to read?" "Sure, I know how to read. I can whip somebody 3 times my size, too. And I know everything I need to know how to live on my own." He bit his bottom lip. "Tell me what type of people you're looking for in Alaska. What does your father call the type of people that are like him?" people that hate the government. And he just expects you to make it from here to Alaska and find those people on your own? And I nodded. Mr. Abiscato sighed and looked at the store window, then back at me. I'm going to tell you something, Moon. Your pap was an unreasonable person. Anybody that expects their 10-year-old son to try and make it from the middle of Alabama to Alaska on just a few dollars is either crazy or plain mean. You need to find a home with a good family that doesn't live out in God knows where with a dirt floor. I felt the anger flash through my head. I jumped up on the seat of my chair and leaped across the counter to land on Mr. Abiscato. He fell back onto the shelves behind, and I started hitting him with one hand that wasn't holding on to him. I pounded him on the cheek over and over as fast as I could. Once he got his balance, he clamped his arms around me so that I couldn't move my fist. Moon, he yelled at me. I kicked him in the knee. Mother mercy, he yelled. I don't mind the way we lived, I yelled at him. Pap and I always got along. Mr. Abiscato twisted me around and held me out by my shoulders so I couldn't see or kick him. God, that hurt, he said. Me and Pap were good friends, I yelled. Best friends. He held me there for what seemed like a long time. I heard him catching his breath behind me, and I stared across the floor. Finally, his breathing slowed again, and he talked to me. Are you going to settle down? If you stop talking about my pap like that, I'm going to turn you loose now, okay? Okay. You're going to sit back down on that chair, okay? Okay. I'm going to set you down now. Okay. Mr. Abiscato put me on the counter, and I climbed back down into my chair. He ran his hand through his hair and rolled his head around his neck. He took a deep breath. A man my age can't take somebody jumping on him like a wild monkey. What's gotten into you, Moon? I picked my sandwich up off the floor and stared at it without taking a bite. I was nervous. I'd never acted like that to Mr. Abiscato. Just don't talk like that about my pap, I said to the floor. Listen, Moon, I'm not trying to be disrespectful of your father. I'm trying to help you out. I'm worried about your sense of reality. I thought about what he was saying and made sure there wasn't anything I didn't like about it. You don't know any better, he said. If your pap just up and dies of a broken leg because he won't see a doctor, what do you think would have happened to you if you would have broken your leg? It's things like that that aren't reasonable, Moon. Refusing to see a doctor when you got the responsibility of a son to take care of? There's something wrong with that. Now he's dead, and you're out walking around on the highway wanting to go to Alaska. I stood, took a step backwards. My hands were shaking, and I didn't know what to do. Nobody's ever said anything bad about my pap, I said. Heck, who would? Who'd you ever let see you that might say that? I set the sandwich down. Are you going to give me money for this stuff or not? Mr. Abiscato shook his head. Suit yourself. I waited while Mr. Abiscato walked to the back of the store to get a chain cutter. My head spun in confusion and my hands still shook from being nervous. It was hard to think straight, so I walked to the front of the counter and stared at that box. When Mr. Abiscato returned, he clipped the lock from the box and he opened it. He pulled out a small roll of money, some photographs, and the watch. There was nothing else to sell. He thumbed through the photographs and studied each one, back and front, for several seconds. He finally showed one to me and asked if I knew any of the people in it. No, sir. He looked at the picture again. This fella here looks an awful lot like your pap. I'd even say it was his brother if I was to make a guess at it. Did he ever tell you that that you had an uncle, or talk about his brother or anything like that? No, sir. Did he ever talk about any family? He said I had a grandpappy that died. He talked about Mama a lot when he didn't think I was listening, when he was working on stuff and talking to himself. Maybe you got other relatives that hate the government. You might have someplace to go. I just want the money for that stuff there. Mr. Abrascato raised his hands in the air. All right, he said. He opened the register, took some money out from it. He put the bills, photographs, and the watch back in the box, and he shut the lid. I'm not going to take your watch that Pap left you. I stuck some money in there with the rest of it. That should help you out. You can pay me someday when you get back from Alaska. Thank you, I said. Anything you need in the way of supplies before you get going? No, sir. I can get mostly everything I need from the forest. Yeah, I reckon you can, Moon. I'll see you later then, I said. You be careful. I nodded. I saw Mr. Abrascato through the store window as I walked back up the road. He had picked up that phone and was talking and watching me leave. I figured he'd called the law, so I tucked that box under my arm and I ran for the trees. Remember, empathize with Moon. What would you be feeling if you knew or you felt like you knew he had just called the law on you? You're by yourself. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 begins with a letter that he's writing Pap. Dear Pap, I think the law is after me now, so I'm going to start for Alaska tomorrow. I meant to ask Mr. Abrascato if he had a map, but I had to whip up on him for talking mean about you. I'm afraid if I go back again, the law will be there waiting on me. Before I left, he gave me some money, and I added it to the money that you already had in the box. I don't know how much it is because I hadn't counted it, but I didn't have to sell your watch. He said you might have a brother, but I know you would have told me about that. He said you might have let me die if it was me that had broken my leg, but I know that's not true either. I'm trying to listen to the sounds outside, but I don't think I'm as good at it as you are. I went out to take a leak a few minutes ago, and there was a coon swimming around in the curing barrel. You'd have thought I'd have heard that. I wasn't lonely today, but I am tonight. I wish there was someone else out here to talk to. Maybe you can talk to me soon if you get a chance. Love, Moon. That night, I started a small fire in the wood stove and burned that letter. After the letter was just ashes, I put out the fire so that no one could see the smoke. The only light left was that of the grease lamp we'd made in a can that flickered and put shadows on the walls. I wondered if I'd ever have a place as nice when I got to Alaska. Then I tried to imagine what the person I would live with would look like. I wondered if any boys my age were there. I felt the loneliness creeping over me, and I laid on the hide pile with my jacket covering me and my hat pulled down low. I hugged my knees to my chest and listened to the night sounds. Eventually, the grease lamp went out, and it was so dark that I couldn't see my hands in front of my face. At one point, I heard something move outside, and fear bolted through me, and I hugged my knees tighter. It wasn't like me to be scared of creatures moving in the night, but I wasn't myself with all the loneliness in that dark hole. Pap, I whispered, thinking that maybe he was out there. Maybe he was going to talk to me and make me feel okay again. I took off my hat so I could hear better and held my breath and listened. Whatever creature that had been moving outside stopped. Pap, can you hear me? I heard the creature scurry off through the leaves. Then I started thinking about the good times I'd had with Pap when we'd swim in the creek and make flutter mills and scratch tic-tac-toe in the dirt. All these memories poured onto me like a waterfall until I was shaking and crying. Then I couldn't take it anymore and leaped off the hide pile and ran into the night. Stop, I cried after the creature. Even if it was just a coon or an armadillo, I wanted something to be with me that night. Don't leave, come back. But my shouts made the rest of the forest creatures duck away and grow silent. I was left standing in the clearing with only the sound of the wind in the treetops. Then I imagined that the law was all around me. I started breathing hard and staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Suddenly, I was running as fast as I could. Spiderwebs covered my face, and tree branches slapped my cheeks. I imagined people running behind me. I wasn't taking any trail that I knew of, but following the gaps in the trees. Sometimes the ground would fall from under me, and I'd roll down a hill, only to get back up at the bottom and just keep going. I crashed through a creek and climbed up a steep bank by clutching tree roots. At the top of the bank was a clearing that I dashed across and then ran on again beneath the tall pines. Eventually, I broke from the trees onto the lawyer's new road. It felt better to have clear space around me where I could see that nothing was hidden and watching me. I started down the road, and the air whistled past my ears and my moccasins patted on the soft dirt. I kept on until the new lodge rose in front of me. The sight of it made me stop and stare at the windows on the second floor. Sorry. "Hello," I said, but not loud enough for anybody to hear. The lodge was dark, except for one lit room on the corner. I stepped sideways across the clearing and saw a man sitting in the room reading a book. I sucked in deep breaths to calm myself, like I always did before I pulled the trigger on a rifle, and my panic began to go away. It made me feel better to watch that man, even though I didn't know him and didn't want him to know I was outside. I could see there was at least one other person in the world besides just me. I sat against that tree at the edge of the clearing. The wind rustled the treetops and reminded me that I'd left the shelter without my jacket and hat. I pulled up my knees to keep warm and watched the room. It was just breaking day when I opened my eyes and saw the man standing over me with a rifle. I leaped to my feet and stared at him. "What are you doing out here?" he said. I was too startled to reply. "Are you lost?" I shook my head. "You're the boy who buried your father, aren't you? The constable's been out here looking for you." I didn't do anything wrong." "Well, I didn't say you did. I was just about to step off into the woods and do a little hunting, and I saw you sitting here." "I'll go now." He put his rifle over his shoulder and motioned toward the lodge. "Come on inside. I'll fix you something to eat. I can go hunting tomorrow." "No, I better not. The law's going to be after me soon." "I've got a chime that goes off, and if anyone drives through my gate, I'll know if someone comes for you. Besides, from what those surveyors said, it'd take an Indian chief to find your shelter." I didn't know what a chime was, but it made me feel better to hear that the constable wasn't close. Do y'all know what a chime is? It's almost like a bell, like, you know how somebody comes to your house and they ring the doorbell, ding, ding. Well, if somebody comes down, Mr. Wellington, that's the lawyer, if somebody comes down his driveway, at the beginning of his driveway, there's something that they drive over that makes that ding, ding sound in his house, so he knows somebody's coming. "Are you Mr. Wellington?" "I am." "I got scared out there last night. I shouldn't be here." "Do you like sweet rolls?" "I've never had any." "Let's go get some then. I got one left on the counter that I didn't eat." I thought about it and watched his face. I didn't know Mr. Wellington, but my lonely sickness was less at the sight of him. I didn't see anything in his expression that told me that I shouldn't trust him, and I still needed someone to tell me about getting to Alaska. Even though my instincts were against it, I stood and I followed him. Once we entered the lodge, I saw Mr. Wellington better in the light. He wore fancy hunting pants and a hat with a turkey feather in it. His face was tight and clean for somebody his age. The only way you could tell he was older than Pap was by his eyes. They looked tired past his silver hair. The lodge was warm inside and smelled of cut cedar and pine. The ceiling was high, and I saw the second story was just windows halfway up the wall. I followed him into the kitchen, where he gave me a napkin and the sweet roll off the counter. I bit into it, and the sugary taste tasted so good that I almost closed my eyes while I chewed it. I followed him into a larger room just outside the kitchen. "Sit down in that chair over there," he said. His hand pointed to a wood chair against the wall. I was disappointed that it wasn't one of the soft chairs in the middle of the room, but I went over to it and sat. Mr. Wellington walked around in front of me and pulled up another, more comfortable chair and sat down. He crossed his arms on his chest. I finished the sweet roll and looked around at the light fixtures and the nature paintings on the walls. "I talked to that friend of yours who owns the store up the road, and he said you all have been out here about 8 years. "Oh, he's not my friend," I said. "Okay." "Pap said you'd run us off," I said. "Well, I just wanted to find out who was living on my property." I studied a painting of an old Indian kneeling by a waterfall and didn't respond. "The surveyor said they found some primitive dwelling of some sort. I suppose that was yours." "It's a shelter. It's built like that so people won't find it." "I see. What kind of pants are those?" "Beaver breeches." "Did your father make those for you?" "No, sir, I made them. I made a deerskin hat, too, but I left it at home." "Interesting." Mr. Wellington must have seen me look over at his television because he said, "Would you like for me to turn it on for you?" I watched his face to see if I could read anything in it. I thought about how lonely it was back at the shelter. I thought about how warm and dry it felt inside the lodge. "Are you going to call the constable on me if I stay?" Mr. Wellington paused for a moment. "No, I'm not going to call the constable. I'm not sure I like his kind." "Can you tell me how to get to Alaska?" "I probably can. I may have some maps in one of those back rooms. Why don't you sit in that chair right here while I see what I can find?" I looked at the soft chair he was pointing to. "Okay." Mr. Wellington turned on the television and then walked away. "I'll be back shortly," he said. I'd only seen television a few times. Mr. Abrascato had a set in his store over the counter. I got up and moved over to the cushioned chair and sank down until my chin touched my chest. I'd never felt a more comfortable chair in my life. There was a show on about lions playing. I'd only seen them in picture books and couldn't take my eyes off of them. Daylight soon slipped through the windows and I grew groggy and lazy. My dog sneezed. An hour must have gone by when I heard someone knocking on the door. Mr. Wellington walked out of one of the back rooms and went to answer the knock. When he opened the door, I saw a man in a suit standing there. I knew right away that he was there to get me. Oh. I knew right away he was there to get me. It was how he looked at me when he stepped inside. I leaped from my chair and ran toward the back rooms where Mr. Wellington had gone earlier. But as soon as I reached the hall, a man in overalls stepped out and grabbed me from behind. He pulled me to his chest and bear hugged me so I couldn't do anything but kick. I kicked backwards at his knees so that he had to walk me into the main room with his legs spread out. He took me over to the man who had come for me and he held me out. "He's all yours if you can hold him," the man in the overalls said. "Mr. Hill's my caretaker," Mr. Wellington said to the man in the suit. "He came in through the back door. We figured this boy would make a run for it." "Well, I appreciate the help," the man in the suit said. I looked at Mr. Wellington. "Liar!" I yelled at him. "Mr. Jean's not the constable," Mr. Wellington said calmly. "He's from the boys' home. He'll treat you a lot better than that constable I met yesterday." "Take it easy," Mr. Jean said. "Nobody's going to hurt you, Moon." I started bucking, kicking, and pounding my arms against Mr. Hill. I thought I was about to slip out once, but he joggled me back up and squeezed me tighter. "This boy needs a bath and a haircut," Mr. Hill said. "I can't stand the smell of him." "I didn't do anything wrong," I yelled. "Moon," Mr. Jean shouted. I kicked at the air again. I hadn't done anything to anybody. "Moon, calm down. Just bring him outside and put him in the car. We'll take him to the home and get him cleaned up." Mr. Jean hurried out to the car and opened the back door while Mr. Hill carried me behind him and Mr. Wellington followed. When we reached the car, Mr. Hill leaned over and shoved me in. Before I could turn around, I heard the door slam shut behind me. It only took a second to look up and see that there were no handles and a plastic shield between me and the front seat. I knew I was trapped. "You liar!" I yelled at the floor. I'd never been in a car. The only time I'd ridden in anything was when Pap came down with a fever once on the way to Mr. Abrascotto's store. He let Mr. Abrascotto ride us in the back of his pickup truck to a place up the road, where we went on foot the rest of the way to the shelter. But it was different then. We were in the truck bed, where the fresh air brushed on our faces. It wasn't much at all like being shut up. It was more like flying. I laid down and I pulled my knees up. The three men talked outside for a few minutes, and then Mr. Jean got in and started the engine. My ear was pressed to the vinyl seat, and I could soon hear the dirt road passing under the tires. After a minute, I felt the car slow and swing onto the highway. I grew woozy, and I listened to the hum of the asphalt. I tried holding my breath to make it go away. "You can sit up, you know." I didn't answer. I stared at the back of Mr. Jean's seat and concentrated on the queasiness in my stomach. Queasiness? Think about what he's feeling. He's never ridden in a car, like in a car before, and he feels queasy. Some people still get like motion sick. They may have to take Dramamine. They get car sick. That's what he feels. When you feel queasy, your stomach feels like, ugh. That's the way he feels, queasy. After a moment, I heard him turn. "Are you okay back there?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I heard the crunch of gravel as the car slowed down and pulled onto the side of the road. I heard Mr. Jean's door open. A steady dinging sound came from the front part of the car. My door opened and Mr. Jean grabbed me by the shoulder and shook me gently. I felt the contents of my stomach lunge forward and splatter against the back of his car seat. "Yeah!" he yelled as he jumped away. He jerked me out and dragged me down into a grassy ditch where he held me under one armpit and let my head dangle. I stared at the ground and thought of nothing except how grateful I was to be out of that car. I breathed the fresh air and felt my stomach easing. "Are you done?" I didn't answer. I moved my eyes and stared at the tips of his shiny leather shoes. He shifted his feet. "Are you feeling better?" I thought about it. I felt better. My stomach was back to normal. I let my eyes creep slowly past the tips of his shoes and up his pants leg. Then I looked down at my left hand, which rested on one slightly bent knee. I remembered something Pap had told me. "Moon, there's no faster way to take a man down than to punch him between the legs with everything you've got. If that doesn't work, take a stick to him." I took a deep breath, balled my fist, and socked him in the crotch. Before I even looked up, he let go of me. I jerked away and took 2 quick steps toward the car. Mr. Jean drew himself inward like a turtle. He closed his eyes and sank to the ground and rolled over onto his side. He pulled his knees tight as a baby and moaned curses at me. Don't you even think about running." I looked in both directions on the road. It was empty. I wiped my mouth on my shoulder, crossed the blacktop, and ran into the forest. So that's today's reading. So now, Moon knows people are after him, right? Now, our new person that we met was Mr. Jean. Mr. Jean is not the lawman. Mr. Jean is a man that owns a boys' home, kind of like an orphanage, but just for boys. That he was going to take him to the boys' home. Moon is now on the run. He's not right at where his shelter is. So you got to think, does Moon know the forest enough to know how to get back to his shelter? Does Moon have that much knowledge? He's 10 years old. He's like your age. Would you be able to manage the forest in a different area and find your way back? It'd be like if somebody drove you off 5 miles up the road. Would you be able to find your way back home? We'll see. I'll see you tomorrow.